Good morning and good afternoon once again. My name is Troy Dumoulin. I'm your host for today's webinar. I'll be presenting the first part of a three-part series on the concept of integrated service management. This is an interesting topic I have a lot of passion about, and I hope to share that with you today and describe what we're talking about. So kind of putting that in context for you, what is it we're exactly going to talk about? I'm not here to talk about a new framework or a new model. What I believe is there are many valuable models in the industry today that can be leveraged, investments that have been made that can be made more optimized, and how to take these activities, these various frameworks and models, and bring them together for a better overall experience for customer delivery and experience from the point of view of requirements to value. That's the story. So very much it's a story of integrated service management. Part of the story is that we're living in different times. And the reality is that it was the best of times, the worst of times, to borrow from Charles Dickens. It's a time of great promise with digital disruptive technology, but it's also a time that, in essence, terrifies us because things have changed so drastically and are changing around us right now. This banner digital transformation, it means simply that the same web technologies that are enabling us to have more seamless market integration with our customer and create higher velocity from requirements to value are also equally available to our competitors. Meaning, we have never been under such pressure as an industry to go faster, better, cheaper. So this is, in essence, some of what's driving the behavior and the focus now around many of the accelerators we're going to talk about today, such as Lean and Agile and DevOps. But the key is, how do they relate to service management, and are they different from service management? You'll get my thoughts on that in this webinar as we describe the various puzzle pieces. And my intent here for this first of the three webinars is to create the picture on the puzzle box. Literally, using that metaphor, it's very difficult to put together a complex picture without the overall picture for you to be given guidance on. So that's the intent, and hold on, strap in. We're going to go quite quickly through a series of different concepts. Not that these concepts sometimes will be new to you, but I'm hoping that the way I describe them in an integrated way is going to be the value you take away from this webinar today. And then in the second and the third, we're going to go deeper diving into some of the aspects we're going to be addressing in today's first of the three-part series. All right, so without any further ado, let's begin talking about the business drivers. Why are we even having this conversation? I've already begun that discussion in the context of some of the changes in the industry around market pressures. And that market pressure has really come to bear the fact that we need to think about value. All of the frameworks we're talking about, ideally focus on value, service delivery value from an ITIL perspective. The reality is DevOps is all about requirements to value and a higher velocity and a higher release cadence. Agile is all about focusing on value in the context of making sure that we do the high value add work first, and that we're constantly reevaluating and reprioritizing, being agile, if you will, as an organization. So the word value is, relevant to everything we're talking about, but what exactly is value and who defines it? That's where we need to begin this kind of conversation. And that's where we're going to turn to Lean from the point of view of probably the best definition, in my opinion, about what is value. And one of the things, of course, Lean will focus you first and foremost on is that value is always in respect of the consumer or receiver, customer, whatever words you wish to use. I know there's some challenges around the word customer for some folks, but in a Lean conversation, it's not complicated. Some organization, some group, some individual provides something, and another person is receiving it. The people on the receiving end are the ones receiving the value. In this case, we'll talk about value from the customer perspective. So value, though, has three dimensions, and those three dimensions always have to be present at some point in the conversation of service delivery. For decades, we focused mostly on service quality, and you could argue that early iterations of the ITIL framework, for example, was all about, getting that thing done at an expected quality and to deliver the value that they're paying for, right? So there's this value received when value received meeting expectations. So did I actually receive the value I'm expecting? Was all about the quality conversation. But also what's important is the concept of speed, right? We need to also understand that if we're not delivering that speed at the just-in-time premise of when that quality needs to be delivered, we also have a problem. I like to use a metaphor when I speak about this, and it's all about understanding maybe this example. For example, let's say I have a 10-year-old daughter, and she loves ponies. A lot of them do. And she says, "Dad, really, when I want my birthday party is I want a pony, and I want to have pony rides." So this is great. So, Dad stands up to the challenge, and he says, "Absolutely, we're going to get a pony ride at your party, sweetheart." So I, get on the phone, I talk to the various suppliers, and I say, okay, got to have a pony, and I come up with an agreement that a pony's going to happen. It's going to come on the birthday of June 2nd. That's the birthday. So I know when the pony has arrived. So quality is pony arrives at the party. The fact that the pony arrives on June 2nd is equally as important to my daughter's, experience here. If the pony comes on June 3rd, not a good situation. The reality is I'm sleeping on the couch, my wife's not talking to me. This can be a problem, right? So the speed and the concept of when, just in time, is equally important. Now, another element of that value conversation has to be cost, because the pony experience has to be at the expected cost. If the pony actually arrives on June 2nd, but, Guido won't unload the pony unless I pay him another $250, right? This is still not going well. My pony experience is not very positive. Now, quality, on the other hand, has two kind of flavors to it, if you want to follow that premise. We've got the quality that there actually is a feature-based conversation here. A pony has, 4 legs. It has a saddle I can actually climb onto, and a halter and a bridle to steer the horse. So these are feature-based conversations. But it's important that I also specify the non-functional requirements. That is that this has to be a nice pony. I wouldn't want this pony coming off the truck and biting somebody. That could lead to liability, right? So the reality is, for this experience, of course, it's a metaphor for any project that you've ever cared to be on. For any value conversation, all 3 of these elements have to be in place. The difference being that at different parts of an economic cycle, some might be in a higher priority than others. For example, for decades, we're going to talk about, the conversation was more about the maturity and the compliance and the quality conversation. When we hit 2008, when the recession, the financial crisis hit, we're suddenly talking about cost, and that's the focus right now, right? So everything is about standardization for reduction of cost. And of course, now with the age of the internet, the digital transformation discussion we had a few minutes ago, it's now about speed to value. So over time, these 3 dimensions change and flux. And so it's not just about knowing that there are 3 dimensions to quality, to value, but at what point, for which specific customer we're talking about, are we talking about the priority? And we have to be constantly dynamically looking at this. So Lean brings us this multiple perspective that allows us to now kind of look at why we're seeing the adoption and adaption of some of what I'll call the accelerators in this presentation. Because right now, without question, we're focusing on speed as the predominant word. There's a reason for that, and this reason is the same reason that organizations have constantly looked at acceleration capabilities like Lean, regardless of the vertical, right? So the reality is, we are in a supply chain. We receive demand from a variety of sources. That demand can come in the form of major capital investments. It can come in the form of requests for enhancement. It can come in the form of new employee onboarding. But the reality is, as a service delivery organization, we are in essence in a supply chain. We receive demand in one side, and through a series of capabilities, we translate that demand into a set of outcomes we call products and services. Now, the problem being that when demand is greater than or outstrips the ability to supply, we now get into a very uncomfortable position. And so this is where our industry finds ourselves, where there's this need right now to go faster. The IT delivery capability to actually scale to meet that growing demand has hit a barrier. For a while, we compensated by giving, up our nights and our weekends, but there's one thing we can't do is create more time. So we're finally having to address some of the issues that have created this inability to scale. And a lot of it comes from silo-based cultural thinking, which creates architectures which are fragmented and redundant. And the reality is we have such variability in our environment, and we can call that technical debt if we want to use that word, because we have cultural debt, we have process debt, and we have technology debt, but we have such complexity in our environment. The implication, and the Lean is very clear about that complexity and variability have very, very common side effects. Complexity, results in higher risk potential, more defect, more rework. The more complex, the slower we're going to go. So there's a real, call out right now, a real demand for how do we reduce the variability and complexity so that we can create standardization and ideally then automate that, which is of course one of the key themes of the DevOps movement. So we've entered this challenging period of time where we have to do something about the fact that demand is outpacing our ability to supply. There's another truism, by the way, from this whole concept of demand and supply, is that demand will always flow. If you're not able to supply, it will find an alternative supply route. So you might be noticing, this concept of shadow IT, and it seems to be growing and on the rise, because the reality is, it doesn't matter if you are, embedded with an organization. It doesn't matter if you have a great relationship with the people who are making demands on your service. Even if you've been, in the family for decades, the reality is if you're the mechanic, you're the babysitter, and you simply can't look at the car for another 2 months, the demand will have to flow somewhere else. This is why we're seeing such a movement now towards what we'll call the accelerators. So this has changed. I'm not sure if you've noticed. I certainly have. The entire theme and philosophy that we're hearing in all of the webinars, the conference agendas, including Pick Elephants, the words that we heard 5 to 7 years ago are not the words we're hearing today, right? Again, I was giving this webinar literally 5 years ago. I would have been speaking about mature, robust, compliance, right? These were the words that were on everyone's lips. Those aren't the words we hear today. In fact, the words we're hearing today are on the other side of the screen. It's all about speed, agility, velocity, better, faster, cheaper, right? It's all this mantra of speed, going back to our current prioritization of which dimension of value is the most important. Now, the challenge with this is, remember, we can't let go of the other two dimensions. One dimension without the other two is going to be equally as problematic. So we have to find a balance here where we're going to find a way to accelerate but still deliver on the quality aspect, which is also the non-functional maturity and compliance side of things, as well as, of course, the cost, right? We can't go so fast that we put the organization in financial jeopardy. So tendency might be, throw it all to the wind and just be agile. But the reality is, agile also means, if you understand what agile is, that we achieve all three of those value propositions. So we do need to find a balance between the two. Admittedly, we might have been overbalanced on the more maturity compliance side of things, so it's time to reset some of the processes for more fit for purpose or just enough. This brings us to the story of why we're even talking about integrated service management. And again, what I mean by that is it's not a new concept or it's not a new set of frameworks or a new model that I'm presenting. There are a number of different models out there that have different goals and objectives that, when leveraged together, can actually have a huge positive impact on this business problem of demand and supply imbalance. So, we've been working with ITIL for decades, and the reality is ITIL is going through has gone through multiple, at least 3 major iterations for improvement, because each time the industry goes through a major change like we're describing in this webinar, ITIL steps up to the plate and actually, represented its new iteration, what that, organization needs, what the industry needs. For example, early 80s, right, when this began, there really wasn't any documentation around what good practices looked like for IT capability. So ITIL was the first thing we had, which was non-proprietary, non-vendor specific, that described what good looked like for capabilities around, service delivery, whether that be a strategic or tactical or operational. In the 2007 era, we got the service focus, right? The orientation on value in respect to products and services. In 2011, we saw the iteration focus now on customer engagement, improved alignment and integration. And now we've just heard recently in the fall that ITIL is being renewed once again, and the theme that we hear is all about this overall value system concept that we're describing today in this webinar. So that's a wonderful thing because ITIL keeps pace with where the industry is going. It's constantly, though, providing an overall view of the map of what does it mean to take demand and produce outcomes and products on the other side. These are the capabilities that we need to do that. Now, the other side of that conversation is that those capabilities have to be accelerated. That's where we're going to turn to our practices such as Lean, Agile, and DevOps as a means to an end to accelerate the entire value system, which we have always been part of. Collectively, these are going to allow us to achieve better, faster, and cheaper. Now, a key point about that is that the reality is we used to be told that, quality, speed, and cost, those are great dimensions, but you can't have all 3. Pick 2 because all 3 aren't possible. But the reality is that when we combine each of these methods and concepts together, it is indeed achievable to hit all 3. And that's why we can look at better, faster, cheaper as a common goal. We don't have to choose between which ones we're going to forego. So to give you kind of the setup for this conversation, I want to first of all talk about the concept of the fact that we are in a supply chain. This is a challenge because of silo-based behavior and organizational structure, we often lose sight of that, right? Each individual exists somewhere within the context of either customer engagement on the front end of the value chain, whether that's strategic through business relationship management, or it's tactical in a request fulfillment, or operational in the context of a service desk, right? There's engagement activities. Some people in our industry, in our organization, operate in that world. We then listen in that engagement conversation, and we're going to then take that demand we're going to capture, and we're going to build blueprints, we're going to design, we're going to build, we're going to test net new value or enhance current value, right? So we take that demand and we create, or the potential for value, because it actually isn't delivered until it's actually in run or operations on the other side. So that represents a supply chain, right? Now, interesting to note, and why this slide is important for us to look at, is it's not just about this horizontal, lateral set of activities that are happening. There's actually 3 different phases of maturity that an organization goes through when they begin to improve their capabilities for delivering value. The first capability, first level of maturity, I should say, is when an organization realizes, hey, I should be good at something, right? So it occurs to them we should be good at service desk, or we should be good at moving things to production, around change and release management, or we should be good at architecture or project management, right? So a given capability is identified for something to focus on and improve on. That's great. That's better than, not focusing on it. That's important. But there's a risk still at this point, because if an organization looks at optimizing a capability as if it lives in mythical isolation, meaning not connected to a greater value system, unfortunately, what can often happen is that bad things can happen with good process. For example, if change management is implemented without understanding who is the customer of change management, I'll just give you that answer. The customer is the group that puts things into the process, right, for orchestration and scheduling to be authorized to promote to production, and then stands on the other side waiting to receive it so that it is now deployed. Now, in my experience, often organizations that implement change management, as one example, will implement it from an operational perspective, from a very much a, keep production stable, risk-free, high availability. And so it's literally implemented as a firewall to production. However, the customer of that process is the builder, whether that's the developer or the project manager or anyone who wants to put anything into production. And what they need is a fast flow, a fit-for-purpose process for submitting and getting changes moved to production, not stopped, in essence, or slowed down. Now, the reality is ITIL gives us a model to do that. I'm not going into detail for how to do this, but the entire basis for the process, is the lean concept, is that it must achieve the goals of its customer. 9 out of 10 times when I see ITIL change management implemented as one example, it's actually implemented contradictory to the goals of its customer. And again, where we get demand outpacing supply, demand will always find another route, right? So step one, you realize that you should be good at something. Step two, it's important that you understand that this something we're getting good at lives within a value chain and has upstream and downstream context and implication. And when we understand that context, we're more apt to design and architect that process in respect to its need to meet the business and the customer need. The step three, that's the next and final step, is that you realize that not all capabilities are linear or horizontal. Some capabilities overarch, as we can see, the overall value system, provide guidance, policy, and direction. This is governance, right? So strategy and portfolio. It doesn't apply to just one step in the value chain. It applies to the overall, providing, in lean parlance, systems thinking and constancy of purpose, creating synergy for all of the people that are in the various value chain activities. Because if we're being agile, but each group is being agile in different directions, enterprise or total system velocity is going to be negatively impacted. So just as there's overarching capabilities, there's also underpinning capabilities which support the overall. And those could be capabilities like architecture, like perhaps problem management, continual service improvement, just to name a few. When we recognize when these specific capabilities actually are underpinning the entire value chain, we understand that the purview and the oversight and the role that it plays is systemic, not just individual process-based. This is important because as we now think about this and we now apply the various models, we'll start to see how does the adoption of lean, agile, and DevOps support faster flow, and that's what we're going for here, a higher velocity from requirements to operations. Remember the 3 stages, right? Capability in isolation, capability in a linear horizontal value chain, some capabilities being over, some being underpinning. So taking that now model of a value chain systems thinking concept, we can look at these 3 accelerators we're going to be focusing on this webinar. I've drawn them in this order because in essence there is kind of an evolution of these things that happen over time in the industry. But I want to point out first and foremost, while I'm going to use these 3 things and describe how they help to accelerate the value chain, I want you to remember that they're accelerating the value chain, right? They're accelerating the work we've always done. They're not replacing it. They're enabling faster flow, right? So it doesn't, because we have lean and agile and DevOps, doesn't mean we don't need a list of capabilities for demand and supply, which is where ITIL comes in. So it's important to understand that these acceleration capabilities are accelerating something. And so this is key. Now, traditionally, we've looked at the ITIL framework like this, right? We see the analysis came out in 2007 as the model and then updated in 2011. But we had this circle of capabilities, strategy being in the middle, then we had design, transition, operation, and continual improvement. And it listed out a number of processes for us. And regardless if you use the term, on the screen, in essence, organizations have these processes today. Now, it's interesting to say that they have them because you might say, well, we haven't, done an official project on, let's say, service level management, or someone the reality is we haven't got our financial management process implemented. I want to challenge that concept for a minute, because often I'm speaking about these practices to senior leadership teams, and they are asking me to come in and speak to them about service management, and they'll say, they got their arms folded and they're saying, why should we adopt these concepts? Before I begin, I ask them a few questions. I say, okay, folks, you have these capabilities that I'm talking about today, but let me ask you, today, do you have conversations with your line of business partner to talk about what they need, where they're going, how we can get there, and then you have to find a way to articulate that into a set of decisions around how you're going to make investments for either net new value creation or enhancement or retirement. You have to, of course, understand the financial implications of that. So you do that today? And they say, well, of course we do. All right, fair enough. So when you've made those decisions about how you're going to invest, you then hand off this work to someone who's going to take it on and do a project, do a build, do an enhancement. They create a blueprint. They gain requirements. They establish both functional and non-functional requirements for this new thing they're building. Right? Do you do that today? Considering how suppliers fit in and what disaster recovery or service continuity considerations, security things you might need to consider? Absolutely, they say. I said, fine, that's great news, right? And then, okay, you now move to that point in the production, value system, and you've got to put this thing into production you've just built and do that in a way that somehow doesn't take down the house of cards you're currently operating. Is that something you're involved in? Yes. What's your point? They say. Okay, just bear with me for a moment. And then when you move it into production, using whatever transition techniques you do, you then have to honor and the encouragement to support what you've actually built. Absolutely. So I say congratulations, because you're already doing everything that the ITIL framework is talking about. There's nothing in the ITIL model today that you're not currently doing. What might not be in the ITIL model right now is something that you are doing that perhaps doesn't happen to be in the map right now. And that's the beauty of ITIL, as it's gone through its several iterations of improvement, is every time we have an update to the ITIL framework, we see a kind of a scope increase. To give you a metaphor here, right? So ITIL, in this update that we're about to see in 2018, do we think it's going to invent new practice, right? Probably not. So when Columbus discovered the so-called New World, I want you to think about this. How new was that world? What really changed? Was it the world that changed, or was it simply the map that changed? So each time ITIL has gone through an iteration of improvement and evolution for moving where the industry has gone, the scope of what it covers as far as a description of the capabilities for value creation and generation, and how those are connected and related, they simply grow each time, just as the map grew. So this is important because what I'd like to demonstrate to you now is take these capabilities, right, that you're seeing here, whether you use these words or not, they're all happening. But now I want you to lay them on their side. I want you to align them in the context of this value chain conversation that we've been having so far. We have certain capabilities for engagement, right? These are the customer-facing, the storefront, if you will, of our service delivery function, whether that's strategic, tactical, or operational. They're incoming demand channels. They intend to feed a set of strategy processes for portfolio and strategy generation. Those in turn are supported by a set of design coordination concepts that primarily focus on non-functional or warranty aspects. And that's important because what's missing in the picture right now is that we don't have any actual build capabilities described in the ITIL model. All right, so what happened? Where is project management? Where is software development? It's funny because the book has always described, And then there's project management over here and software development over there, but there hasn't been a real clear picture or map put together, right? So that's something that perhaps needs to change. But the reality is I have these strategy conversations, right, that generate at least the design conversation, non-functional requirements coming out of these processes like security, supplier management, service level management. That means I move to production and I get to run. So I'm pointing this out because looking at it in a linear fashion like this is much more logical if we understand that we're talking about a supply chain. And now we're going to be able to use supply chain acceleration techniques like Lean to find a way to look for improvements in how to create faster flow from requirements on the left to supply on the right. So this is where we're going to be now leveraging in some of these accelerating models that we've talked about. Okay, one of those being Lean. Now Lean, of course we know, isn't something new. It's been around literally since the 1940s, and you could actually argue even earlier than that. But it was a set of techniques that originally developed in the Toyota organization, was named the Toyota Production System, and these techniques literally were designed and developed over time to address the same problems we're facing now that I've described in this webinar, where the business demand is higher than our ability to supply because of our fragmentation, which is in representation of waste and issues with flow and defect and rework. So things like establishing voice of customer, what is the value added work? Principles around how do I actually achieve standardization and simplification by removing waste. In fact, it talks about 3 types of work: value add, which is the work creating value; necessary non-value, which is necessary administration, but let's be clear, it's not creating value, it supports indirectly value creation, right? There has to be some governance, but too much is too much. And then of course there's waste. We can remove that because that's just crazy stuff. Lean doesn't just give us the ability to look at something and see waste for the first time in a clear way. It also gives us problem-solving capabilities. Using DMAIC and Kaizen events, it allows teams to swarm around an issue cross-functionally and to address bottlenecks and waste issues and get something completely fixed within a short period of time. Visual management tools like Kanban boards and dashboards make the invisible visible. It's a key principle of Lean, right? You can't govern what you can't see. So especially within knowledge work, like we're talking about in this value chain, if your processes are in people's inbox, invisible, you can't understand where the impediments to flow are actually happening. So using visual management tools, we can actually extract the invisible process from the inbox and create more visibility by leveraging these tools. We can then understand how do we work together in more higher collaboration and where are we seeing impediments to flow, right? Breaking the project down from big monolithic projects into small batches, minimizing how much work we actually keep in progress because we can't truly actually multitask. So the more work we try to hold in the air at any given one time, studies and research show that's going to detriment impact flow. So I'm pointing this out only to simply understand this from a couple different perspectives. One, Lean is all about taking any process, whether that's an individual process or a macro value stream that we've been talking about so far, and to look at how you increase velocity of that given process and or system of processes that we're looking at. It's entirely focused on acceleration. What we're going to see is that Lean is, in essence, a predecessor of Agile and DevOps. Of course, it came first. In fact, I'm going to make the case for many of the practices you see in Agile, such as product backlogs, which are groomed or prioritized based on customer value. That's a voice of customer prioritization technique. Breaking large projects down into smaller batches, we call them sprints. Using visual management tools like Kanban boards or burn down charts, these are principles of visual management. In essence, visual management and all the aspects of Lean are the foundational concepts we're going to see largely that are going to be behind some of the Agile software and project method, as well as the DevOps activities we're focused on. So using these concepts, Remember, we're talking about a value chain, and a value chain is going to be no faster than its limiting bottleneck or constraint. This is the concept of theory of constraints. Until we can see something, again, you have to make the invisible visible, something as a system of value. I can literally see it like we're seeing it on the screen right now. Demand comes in the left, we have supply coming out the right. We aren't in a position to understand where the constraints or bottlenecks are, or where we can apply lean for the most important and I'd say greatest impact. So lean applies to that whole value stream as well as any individual process. Now let's play this forward. Okay, so I'm going to bring you now into the 1990s and early 2000s. You see, going back to the supply chain concept, IT as an entire system didn't realize or feel the urgency of this demand-supply inequity all at the same time. The first participants in getting faster, as you could well imagine, were the people on the front end of the value chain, people who were dealing with the demand capture and had to do plan, build. So this is, of course, the world of software development, right? So faced with growing backlog of work, faced with challenges for the ability to actually get work done, individuals began to find ways using lean concepts to create higher velocity and flow through faster iterations. This becomes agile. It just happens that in IT, we have this kind of not invented here syndrome, so we like to rename. So agile really, if you look at many of the key concepts of agile, regardless of what agile flavor you're looking at, agile is really lean software development, right? It's about how do I not simply move faster and get better flow, but it's also about how do I create better feedback loops, right? If I want to be able to, first of all, not go too far down the path in a wrong direction. So in the Agile Scrum context, if you're going to actually do a sprint, at the end of that sprint, Agile Scrum as a method requires you to actually do a customer review and feedback loop. You can't go on to the next sprint, right? You can't pass go, collect $200 until you do a customer feedback loop called a review. Also, what I love about Agile Scrum is it also requires the sprint participants to go through a continual improvement activity called a retrospective, meaning they have to meet to describe, okay, what went well, what didn't go so well, and how do I make the next sprint faster? So not only can I, adjust direction and scope on every iteration, but I'm also focusing the team on continual improvement for the very purpose of increasing velocity and ensuring that the high value work is always the focus of the organization. Right, so a key thing though I want to put out there before we got to go further into this conversation, right, is remember that system mindset. Remember that value chain. Imagine the organization is, wanting to be agile. The word agile, velocity, these are the words of the day. We've already talked about that. But imagine if each of the different silos, the planning silo, the building silo, the move to production silo, the operate silos, what if each of those different silos were all attempting to be agile in different directions, meaning they didn't share common belief, common practice, or common priority? The reality is that agility, when it's considered at a local level, can actually cause even more detriment to overall system velocity. For a system, a value system, which we live in, to actually be agile, it has to be agile as a system, meaning we have to have constancy of purpose, which is a lean principle, and systems thinking in our application of agile practices. This is key, because we can actually go the wrong direction, right, if we don't think about this. So this classic project management component is we have this major project to get done. We look at it as one major monolithic objective, and we try to move that, the marker as one big project. The reality is it might take us 4 to 6 months to do this, right, or even longer. The problem with that statement is that we live in such a dynamically changing world that week to week things change, and what was true before is no longer true now, and what was urgent before is no longer the urgent thing we're dealing with at this moment. So a better practice is to break the bigger project down into smaller chunks, get something done, get a feedback loop going about what that was, what that accomplished, and then ask the question, do we still keep going, or do we need to realign and reassign our resources to something else, allowing the organization to adopt and adapt to, changing pressures and dynamic conditions. The Agile concept not only creates higher flow and better feedback and customer integration and collaboration, it allows us to adjust much better. Okay, so there's a principle behind Agile that's also very cool. It fits people better. In essence, it actually makes sense from a human nature perspective. An interesting premise. The reality is, we talk about classic project management. It's been nicknamed now waterfall, right? And we talk about Agile being more adaptive. The key words here is predictive versus adaptive. If I've got to get something done, a major project, and I'm going to replicate something that's been done before, I can predict up front what the requirements are. So, there's no challenge using a kind of a linear project management method when the thing that I am doing, the application, the software that I'm developing, is simply replicating something I've done. If I'm building a network, I'm not going to innovate my way towards a network. However, when we're focused on an innovation-based project, it's kind of silly to assume that we can establish all of the requirements up front, establish a fixed time frame and a fixed budget on something we've never seen before or never built before. So for innovation type projects, Agile simply makes more sense because I only have to plan for the initial prototype or wireframe. In Agile we call it an iteration. And it allows me to do something, get some feedback, and here's the thing. The moment you see something, you're going to have 5 new ideas, right? This is simply just the way human nature works. So think about that. Now, how does this fit? This is now kind of plugging in the Agile piece into the pie. Right, so ITIL itself, until this point, hasn't really talked about the build practices, right? It's referred to them and said, go over there, look over there for that piece of the information. But neither has the project management or Agile, methodology of choice identified or acknowledged that it lives within a bigger ecosystem. This is important because that build capability, whether you use classic project management or Agile, is important to understand that it fits right into the entire value chain as a missing piece of the puzzle, right? It's not the entirety of the puzzle. There are capabilities on the left, there are capabilities on the right, and left to its own focus, the project backlog, right, the product backlog in this case, would focus primarily only on feature-based conversation. What the ITIL service design processes are going to be able to feed into now this product backlog that we see now as the heart or the engine room of the net new value creation is that while the features are coming from the left, right, the horse has to have the 4 legs in the saddle, the non-functional requirements being fed into your work breakdown structure or your user stories are being fed into this product backlog concept by processes like availability, IT service continuity, security management, right? This is the whole premise of the DevOps space. They're talking about DevSecOps, meaning security. They've highlighted security as one thing, but the reality is there are many different non-functional requirements that would have to be fed in to this conveyor belt moving left to right. So we have to be able to visualize the build capability, right, as within the larger value system, being chartered by the strategy and being fed with the non-functional of design, and also being supported in its orchestration for promotion to production using transition, right? So we need to look at this now in this model. We're not quite done. There's one more piece. So now we come to DevOps. Now the interesting thing is, as Lean began the velocity conversation, Agile picks up Lean concepts. Notice what's in the middle of the DevOps principle, right? DevOps focusing on the principles of collaboration, okay, and that's addressing the issue of silo-based thinking and architecture. We need to look at this now as more of a systemic end-to-end value system. It's focusing on, if we have this value chain, we need to find a way to move into an automation of the value chain, not just point solutions for individual tasks and activities, but an integrated digital pipeline, literally automating the flow of movement left to right. How are we going to do that? We're going to focus on value. We're going to remove waste. We're going to ensure that we have lean metrics, and that's what we're seeing in the measurement, like cycle time, which is a measure of end-to-end velocity of a total system, or lead time. In Lean, that's the measure of customer request to receipt of value, right? We see that also expressed in the Agile concept of escape defects. Many of the measures we're moving to are about, customer experience. So, what is DevOps? That's an interesting question as we wrap this up, because DevOps is really not one thing, and this is often confusing for folks. DevOps is a collection of a set of technical, process, structure, teaming, and cultural-based practices to achieve this accelerated value objective. So DevOps is all of the above so far that we've been talking about. It applies to using Lean and Agile. It's talking about theory of constraints, identifying bottlenecks. Remember, you can't accelerate nothing. You're accelerating the value chain, which is where IT service management and SDLC and project management come in. But it's also about a couple of new things, which I've identified in green, right? So this is where we're getting into the architecting for higher velocity using microservices and containers, being able to do automated testing and deployment. So, just to wrap us up, let's address the final components of this, which is the automation side of our question. But DevOps is all of the above, not just the automation. So here we have a picture describing a digital pipeline, okay? The reality is the goal of DevOps, of course, automation, but it's also about cultural collaboration and improved flow, which you have to address through everything we've described so far. However, at the end of the day, we're also focused on automating that delivery value chain. And this vision of creating this pipeline is at the heart of a lot of the DevOps conversations and webinars. But I want you to think about this for a moment. Before we can actually successfully move to automation, there's a couple of conditions that have to be met. The first condition is we as a group of people have to agree that there's one way to do something, one way to do code commit, and one way to automate provisioning. Because the goal here isn't for every product team to come up with their own pipeline. The goal here is that we come up with a platform as a service, digitally enabling backbone for each of the product teams to leverage in a many-to-one perspective, because that will reduce variability, complexity, allowing us to go at higher velocity at lower cost. So once we get the goal of, can we agree that there is one way to do something? The second is, can we make sure that what we're going to do is automated to its best optimization, meaning we have to look at that practice and we have to remove waste and we have to lean it out. The third state here is that we then can automate it. Now, the interesting premise about this again is that most of the time we have these various elements of automation, but they initially exist as a single standalone best-of-breed product. That's not the goal either. What we're trying to do here is create literally a left-to-right automation of value chain where the output of continuous integration becomes the input of automated build, and so on and so on. So we're literally creating a conveyor belt to move code from left to right. The key principle, though, is that we're looking to do this with a shared platform as a service, not where every product team gets to create its own product pipeline. That goes against the whole goal of standardization and simplification. So in essence, let's finish this picture off now at the end of this webinar. right? This is kind of the end of the picture on the puzzle box, and it looks a little bit overwhelming, and I built you the story to get here, right? Now we put underneath the overall value chain the integrated automation that allows us to take requirements on the left and produce supply on the right. So the principle being here that we're going for the better, faster, cheaper. At Pink Elephant, we believe that to achieve that, you have to look at the full stack. We have cultural challenges around silo behavior and structure. We have process issues where processes are, implemented actually contradictory to the goal of flow, not to improve it. We have automation issues where we have multiple tools that do the same thing, or multiple groups, implementing the same tools and creating more complexity. To achieve DevOps, we have to achieve the full stack, looking at all three of these key elements. And when we understand this context and we understand that we're at a value chain, what we're describing and what you're looking at right now is what is integrated service management. It's taking and optimizing all of these together. Unfortunately, what's happening often is that these things aren't working together. They're occurring in your organization, but they're occurring in different parts of your organization. You have someone doing ITIL over here for the last 10 years. And you have another group over here looking at Agile, another group over here espousing Lean, another group over here saying we're doing DevOps. And rather than having these integrate and optimize the flow, they're actually competing for resources and mind share, creating even more consternation and negatively impacting the overall goal of higher velocity in service delivery. For us to get better and to achieve the goals of the business for digital transformation, we have to optimize through integration, not by having a war around who has the best framework and model. So that's the story of integrated service management. I speak about this quite a lot. I have a blog, as you can see, where you can see some of the articles and podcasts that I've written. But again, I want to plug for the next two webinars in this series. In the next webinar, what we're going to be doing is focusing on using Agile, but Agile more than just software development. How can we leverage Agile in operations? How can we leverage Agile for process improvement and process design? In the third, we're going to look at the teaming conversation. How do we deal with the silo-based culture by establishing cross-functional teams? What does it mean to create a cross-functional team by product where we have a representation from various silos? How does that evolve over time? What kind of leadership do we need to enable this horizontal systemic premise using cross-functional product-oriented teams? That'll be session number 3. So I'm looking to see if we have any questions here. Rihanna, I'm going to see if we have anything to address. I think we're pretty much out of time, but the reality is, hopefully, folks, you found this useful, and it set the story for the next 3 sessions we're going to be doing. Okay, so it looks like we're good on the questions. Thank you. I'm seeing the chats coming in. Again, hope to see you at the next 2. Have a great afternoon, folks. Take care.